Welcome to the Radical Rhythm Podcast. This has been created for those of us that love radical women who live perhaps by the rules, but also question and challenge the status quo. We want more from our lives, to enjoy our sexuality, to explore radical thought, and to celebrate women who have lived and continue to live unconventional lives. Hi, I'm Dr. ToniBearEdd, sexologist, educator, activist, and definitely a radical woman. Thank you for joining me as I share stories of women challenging the status quo and living life to the fullest. Join me as we unapologetically march to the beat of a different drummer together. Welcome to the Radical Rhythm Podcast. Today we have Crystaline Randazzo, and I am very excited. She is an expert storyteller, and she's coming to us today from DC. And when we invite her back again, she might be coming from somewhere else at that time, but I'll let her tell you this story. Storyteller, Crystaline, thank you so much for being here. And can you tell our audience a little bit about yourself and how you
Sure.
got to be an expert storyteller?
Yes, that's I think a variety of stories, but I'll try to keep it brief. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. I really started out as a photographer. I thought I wanted to just be a photographer. You know, that was sort of my dream. I always had been artistic, and I first became a photographer. I thought I was going to shoot fashion. And then, as is prone to happen to some of us, I met someone who was about to go travel the world. And he took me first to a place where there was really no fashion photography. So I ended up in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. And shortly after I arrived, I survived the Haiti earthquake. And we had only been there a few months, and this earthquake hit. And I think that it changed the trajectory of my life, because when you live through something like that, I think you change your priorities. And I lived through that, and I became very focused on humanitarian photography, which progressed to humanitarian videography, which progressed to an obsession with story and science and how stories work. And, you know, fast forward 12 plus years later, here I am working primarily in stories and how everybody, not just nonprofits or humanitarian organizations, and specifically women, how they can use stories to change the way they look at their lives and their businesses.
Wow. You know, this whole program is about women who march to the beat of a different drum. And I think you just gave us 3 different drums in one short story. You know, most photographers I know do not photograph humanitarian topics, right? And now you're working with storytelling and women.
Yeah.
Now, you know, I've read somewhere or another that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. Is is there a difference between the way men tell stories and the way women tell stories?
I think there is. And, you know, I also think that there's a spectrum of the masculine and feminine in all of us, and we all land in different places in that, however that may be. But I believe, and this is what I've seen in my work specifically, and because I primarily work with women, it may not be the best litmus test for men, but I believe that women often figure out what they want and what they're doing and what direction they're going when they tell their stories. And some of us have been shamed for a long time for speaking without thinking. But I actually think what we're doing when we talk about these stories, when we actually reflect on our lives, which in our modern world, we don't really have great systems for that, we are figuring out what we believe and what motivates us and how we want to be in the world. And for me, that is one of the most powerful things that I have been able to witness in my work as a storyteller and a story facilitator.
Yeah, a friend of mine this week, we were having a conversation, and I somehow, some way, I'm going to try to match you guys up. She just went through a really rough divorce, a really rough divorce, and her children are grown. They're out of school, they're out of college now, and they're starting their lives. And like a lot of people who retire, she feels like she's kind of lost her identity. She doesn't know who she is. And I try to get her to engage in conversation and story. And the only story that keeps playing again and again and again is almost like a traumatic experience of this divorce. Um,
Mm.
do you find that, are there some folks, and especially women, since you work with women, that can't pull a story out?
Yeah, it's interesting. I believe that the story that we tell ourselves in the moment is everything. It affects the way we think, believe, and act. It changes whether we want to get out of bed in the morning. And sometimes, because we're human and all humans basically are more prone to remember a negative story than a positive one, because that's how we've survived for eons, they can get stuck in a particular narrative where they can see no way out. They can only sort of stay in this narrative loop, and it tends to be a narrative that's negative, if that makes sense. And so what I find is if you can create spaces where women actually have the opportunity to look back at other areas of their life, not just the place where that negative loop is, you can change that narrative because the pieces are still the same, but you get to reframe that. So what I find is that sometimes many of us, any of us, this has happened to all of us probably in our lives, we can get stuck in what I call the negative story loop, where we basically sort of relive a certain narrative over and over again, and they tend to be negative. And the reason why the human brain remembers negative experiences better than positive experiences is because that is how we've survived. And so when I'm working with women who are stuck in a story, so I have a really great example of somebody similar. One of my clients came to me, her name was Rachel. She said, I'm just a washed up housewife with no skills.
Mm.
Right? So it's a very sad introduction. We are so mean to ourselves.
Yes.
Like we say things about ourselves that we would never say about anyone else. And through the process of working through her story, of course, I learned she had been a producer. She had worked for the BBC. Even after she left her career to raise two children, she worked for hospice groups to take like oral histories. And she was a talented storyteller in her own right, but she only had this one story. And she said, at the end, like, I realized that I had woken up every morning and told myself I'm the washed up housewife with no skills story. For so long, I didn't even know there was another story. And it took a reflective process for her to move back. And so that's what I really recommend to women who are stuck in the loop is you have been many people in your life. You have thousands of stories, and you always have a choice as to what story you want to tell yourself.
That's wonderful. Yeah. I think we've talked, and boy, have we've talked in the past as new friends. And I think I just bop from story to story. I swear I'm different people within the hour, sometimes, let alone a lifetime. I can't imagine having one story or only remembering one story. And
Yeah.
you mentioned the brain, and that is a wonderful segue. Um, you are the only person that I know in the world that combines storytelling and neuroscience and the brain. Now, I'm sure there's other people, but I have not met them. I know many storytellers and some of the best storytellers. Um, how did this interest come about?
It's a great question. Um, I think the science came into my work around 2013 or 2014. I was working as a filmmaker and a photographer at the time. I was still doing humanitarian work. And I made this commitment to myself to do a year of story study. I was very frustrated at that time that I would be making media pieces, and sometimes they were beautiful media pieces that didn't get the level of engagement or promote the kind of action that I wanted to see happen when I made a film or, was trying to promote a certain cause. And so I decided that even though I knew a lot about filmmaking and storytelling and or filmmaking and photography and writing, that what I really needed to understand was how storytelling worked. And so I did. I spent a year, and every week I set aside a number of hours, somewhere between 2 and 4 hours, and I read everything I could get my hands on storytelling. And a lot of that ended up being scientific studies about how storytelling works. And so I slowly started to collect these information, and I always thought, like, I'm just like the nerdiest filmmaker ever, right? Like nobody else, everyone like is trying to make the most cinematic film, and I'm like, how do we get it to connect? How do we use the science to make sure it connects? But what I found through this research process was that we are missing big parts. Sometimes we're telling a great story, but we're not editing in a way that sticks with our audience. And if we lose them, what's the point, right? We need to actually engage them. And there's very specific ways that the brain works around stories. And there's ways that we can harness that so that our stories actually lead to the kind of change that we're hoping for.
Oh, wow. Now, do I ask you for the secret sauce now or later? I
How much time
mean,
you got?
right. So, uh, what can I ask one way that a story sticks in someone's brain to have them remember something? And then I'm going to follow up with another question about how does that jump neurons to the action part of the brain?
Yeah, instead of one, I'm going to give you three because I'm just so generous, right? So
Okay.
there's
Thank you.
three things that we need for narrative transportation to happen. So what narrative transportation is in layman's terms is that's what happens to you when you're watching a movie or reading a book and you lose all track of time, right? I know that's probably happened to you, just like an hour is gone. So what's happened in that scenario is you've gone into the world of the character and you actually become them. You think
Mm.
and believe and act like them in your mind. So you only need three things for narrative transportation to happen. You have to feel commonality with the main character, and you have to feel empathy for their experience. So you need to go on some sort of emotional ride with them where you feel like you can connect to what they're going through. And the last piece that you need is just sensory or visual details. And a lot of people miss this in telling their stories. They sort of list out the facts of what happened, and they don't talk about the experience. They don't talk about what they smelled or what they heard or how somebody looked. And those things are what actually allows your audience to visualize in their mind your story and to go there. When you do that, the brain actually releases oxytocin if the person is able to narratively transport. And then those people trust you. Their brain releases oxytocin. Oxytocin tells the brain, this person is trustworthy. They're safe to approach. You feel connected to them. And I think that's what everybody wants to do when they tell stories.
Yeah, it's a basic human need, right? For all of us to feel a connection to other people. The idea that somebody is an island and they don't need anybody, um, I don't know how that exactly happens, right? That connection is so important. And it sounds like that an ability to tell a story real well and have somebody trust you um, that much should not go into the hands of evil people, like selling you expensive things, or I don't know, like, here's all my money. Thank you.
Well, we know that big brands are already using storytelling, right? I mean, that's what Apple is doing, that's what Coca-Cola is doing. But I really believe that there's a lot of heart-centered entrepreneurs that could be using it in the same way. But we just don't necessarily even have the lingo in in our entrepreneurial world. I think people sort of know that storytelling is sexy, but they don't actually know how it benefits them, as humans. And I don't see it as like a sleazy marketing technique. I see it as building real deep human connection with other people. And that's what's so exciting to me. But I will admit that really anybody can use it. And we've seen lots of people and politicians across the stage use storytelling to their own means. And it's not always beneficial out in the world. But I hope that more of us who are heart centered and actually care about what we're building can use it and create more good in the world.
So I would imagine from what you just said that you work with people in the field of business. Are there other areas or other industries that, well, you said storytelling works everywhere, but is there another genre or two that you particularly work with?
Yeah, I always say I like change makers, and for me, a change maker can be a lot of things, right? I work with lots of interesting people. I work with like profitability consultants who are trying to make sure women are making just as much more money or just as much money as men. I work with uh, like goddess theologians who want to change the idea of menstrual shame. You know what I mean? What I like to do is I like to work with people who really have innovative ideas that they want to share and action that they want to create in the world. And so for me, that could be quite varied in who my clients are. But I think it's really exciting to think that we could just be using our stories, something that we already have within us, to change the world, to change the way people think about something. And I don't say that as like Pollyanna, let's go change the world. I say it as like people who are really building a shift and change through every person that they touch and the work that they do.
Oh, beautiful. I just had a conversation yesterday and up to 3 o'clock last night, I was on a roll. And then this
Wow.
morning again with a young female identified person who lives in Costa Rica. And she
Mm.
is part of a group that is very active politically in trying to get more rights for queer folks in Costa Rica. So I asked her, the group that I'm going to present to in a couple weeks in San Jose, it is the group. She said there's about 7 women. I said, is it like 7 female activists, right? And she said, no, no, we're not activists. This man is, and this man is, and this man is. But we're just women that are part of the group, right? So I wrote to her and I said, well, maybe perhaps there's a language difference here. When I use activist, I said, I see, and I haven't met your group yet, but I see a group of women coming together and telling their stories collectively is a powerful thing. And in that, you are an activist, as I define activist, because you change the world of your own generation, the next generation, from what you learn from one another. And this morning, she wrote back to me and she said, well, you might have a point. I can't wait till you come, right? Um,
Absolutely. I would say she's definitely an activist, but we all choose different words to describe ourselves, right? But that kind of collective experience, that is what I learned actually in my humanitarian work, right? I now have a lot of thoughts and theories about humanitarian work after working in it so long, and we don't have to go into that today. But I think I have learned through that work that communities always know what they need, and they can express what they need through these stories of their lives and through their experiences. And there is great power. And I believe that for many generations, women have not been able to freely tell their stories, and that this time is a time when we can actually do that. And that's particularly why I like to facilitate storytelling with women. There's something powerful about being able to speak our truths, to share what we've experienced when for so many generations it was sort of silenced. And I would imagine that that applies across many different spaces of any community that has been silenced. That storytelling can be very healing. It can also be very traumatic if it's, if we don't make space for the healing. And that's something else I learned in nonprofit photography, right? Like that sometimes stories are extracted in ways that are more harmful than helpful.
So, Crystalline, I'd be remiss since I am a sexologist.
Yes.
And here it comes. Here it
Okay, I'm
comes.
ready.
A question I didn't give you ahead of time. That we,
Okay.
in fact, I don't think I gave you any questions I asked you today. Um, but so, the groups of women I normally work with and get together love to tell erotic stories to one another. I think there's a word called body storytelling or something.
Mm.
Different women belong to these groups and they love writing erotica and telling the story and reading the stories to one another. Can you tell me? I'm not much of a fiction writer. I'm more of a researcher, nonfiction kind of writer. Explain to me, because that part of my brain is not well developed. Um, what kind of neurological satisfaction are they getting from that?
Well, I think they're likely, this is not my area of expertise either, but just as a storyteller, what I would say is that the benefit that they're getting is they're actually physically experiencing those things in their brain. So when they read that erotic experience on the page, they they like the main character, they have commonality with the main character, they feel empathy, and that author has provided narrative details that help them transport in, then they actually experience that in their body. I think that's why erotica works so well, likely, is because they are narratively transporting and feeling everything that that main character feels. And I think that extends to pleasure, which is really exciting, right? That's the power of story. You can, be in your home on your couch, and yet you could be a million miles away in the middle of a story.
Right. So, what I'm getting from this is that I've really been missing out because I've been watching pirate and war movies and battles. And I've been in the trenches in World War One so many times, right?
Yeah.
By watching movies about war. Um, but if I had been watching sexier movies and sexier programs, or reading them or telling stories, I would have had a much pleasurable life.
That's one way to insert pleasure in there, I think, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. I used to
but
just go
but
have
also,
sex.
who's to say that you did not receive pleasure from transporting into these war movies as well, because that's novelty and thrill and excitement. It's just maybe not the same level of sexual pleasure that you're getting from erotica.
Well, today is Friday, and Friday nights are my date night by myself. So
Ooh.
I think what I'm going to do is to write an erotic story about you said sensory, right? The
Yeah.
cold steel hard in my hands. And I think, I
Yeah.
can do this. I think I
I
can
think
do
you
this.
can do it. I love it. Yeah, those sensory details are so important. That's how people transport.
Oh, Crystalline, thank you so much for coming in. Can you tell our audience? I mean, before we got started today, I said, I am definitely going to be working with you. I want to take one of your classes. And if I can afford you, I definitely want to have some coaching as well. For the audience, both Crystalline and I met in a class about being a speaker on stages. And my interest is to be on that stage. And I know that I have some additional growth that has to happen before I get there. If someone else is as interested as I am, how would they get a hold of you?
Yeah, well, the easiest way is to go to my website, which is my name. It's www.crystalinerandazzo.com, and I'm sure that will maybe be in the notes somewhere.
I'll put
It's
it
not.
underneath.
It's a tongue twister, but that's my name. So I would, of course, welcome any women who want to learn how to tell better stories. And I would say it applies to both women who are stuck and women who are entrepreneurs who maybe struggle to talk about what they do in the world. I think the easiest and best way to do that is through story. And I know, Toni, that you and I are going to work together because we just had an almost instant connection. I feel like, ooh, when you see your person and you're like, oh, yay, like this is what the people I like. I could tell right away. And I think that there's so much commonality in our works, even though we're in totally different areas, the things we care about. And I just know we're going to be fast friends. And you have so many stories to tell. I mean, you have had such a life, and I can't wait to hear more of them.
And as you as well, my friend. And your next tour is in Milan, right?
Milan, Italy. I know you're going to come so you can practice your Italian.
And I'm going to stay there until your husband says, would that lady please go away?
Nope. We're like, nope, sorry, you go first.
Well, I will share with him all the vowels and all of my names, and maybe Mr. Randazzo and I can find a commonality.
Right.
So
he loves an Italian. It's like, he knows his people. So I'm sure you guys will get on so well.
Thank you so much. I know this is just a little tease or taste for our audience. And I know my reoccurring guest, Vi Johnson, who is the director of the Carter Johnson Library, is sitting on the edge of her seat, looking down at the notes, looking for your website to write you a letter. And I'm sure she has a half a dozen more questions because she is a griot and she trains other griots, which is another storytelling kind of tradition. So,
oh, I love it. I love it. I can never meet enough storytellers, and I'm such a curious person by nature. I never think I have all the answers. I'm like, oh, I have so much more to learn. So I would love that so much. And thank you for having me and for thinking, to bring me on here. It's just always a pleasure to have a conversation with you.
Thank you. With you as well. Thank you for listening to the Radical Rhythm podcast today. It has truly been my pleasure to invite guests and talk to you about my passion, the joy in our sexuality, and radical women who march to the beat of a different drum. If you'd like to work with me, Dr. Toni Bear, I have a community where I give seminars every month. I also have a coaching program, both group and individual, and also a course, a self-directed course, because it's all about experiencing the joy life has to offer. I'd love to work with you. Check out my link below, www.ToniBearEdd.com. See you next week, and don't let anyone dim your shine.